The gavel fell like a gunshot in the stifling Arizona heat, silencing the buzz of flies and the murmurs of dusty ranchers. It wasn't land or cattle being auctioned in Redemption Gulch that day. It was a woman's reputation. Sterling Croft, a man whose wealth was matched only by his cruelty, laid down the bet with a voice that cut through the silence. He wagered his prize bull against a pittance that the giant tracker, Kalen Blackwood, the man they called the Apache Ghost, couldn't spend a single night with the town's most untouchable figure, the beautiful grieving widow Hayes. But the real wager wasn't about cattle or coin. It was a cruel game of honor and shame, and when the widow finally took off her wig that night, the truth revealed would be far more shocking than any small-town scandal. It would be a ghost story written in flesh and blood. The air in Redemption. Gulch's auction house was thick enough to chew a foul stew of sweat, cheap whiskey, and desperation. The year was 1878, and the desert sun beat down on the corrugated tin roof, turning the hall into an oven where men's tempers baked and rose like bad bread. Kalen Kai Blackwood stood near the back, a mountain of a man who made the space around him seem small and fragile. At 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that strained the seams of his leather vest and hair as black as a starless night, he was an unnerving presence. His mixed heritage, a rumored Irish father, and an Apache mother had carved his face with a unique severity, high cheekbones, a strong jaw, and eyes the color of storm-tossed slate that missed nothing. He was a tracker, a bounty hunter, a man who moved with a predator's silence that belied his immense size. He wasn't here to bid, but to collect a debt from a rancher who was selling off his last few head of cattle. Across the room, preening like a prize rooster, was Sterling Croft. Croft owned the biggest cattle operation in the territory, the Diamond Sea, and he wore his influence like a tailored suit. His face was perpetually flushed with arrogance and expensive liquor, and his small, piggish eyes followed the proceedings with a predatory gleam. There was old bad blood between him and Kai. Years ago, Kai had tracked down and returned 2 of Croft's rustlers, but had refused the bounty when he discovered Croft had hired the men himself to raid a smaller competing ranch. The public exposure had shamed Croft, and the cattle baron had never forgiven him for it. The auction droned on saddles branding irons a tired-looking mare. Then the auctioneer, a portly man named Byron Finch, cleared his throat with a nervous cough. Next we have, from the estate of the late Mr. Bartholomew Hayes, a silver-inlaid music box. A hush fell over the room as a woman in mourning black stepped forward from the shadows. This was Mrs. Gwendalyn Hayes. She was a figure of quiet speculation in Redemption Gulch. She had arrived 2 years prior as the bride of Hayes, a man 30 years her senior, and had lived in near seclusion on his ranch, the Whispering Creek. Since his death from a fever 6 months ago, she had been seen only in town for supplies, her face always obscured by a thick black veil, her posture one of graceful sorrow. Today the veil was lifted, but she remained an enigma. She was younger than most had imagined, perhaps in her late 20s, with a porcelain complexion that seemed untouched by the harsh Arizona sun. Her eyes were a deep, sorrowful green, and her mouth was set in a line of dignified resolve. But her most notable feature was her hair, a perfectly coiffed arrangement of auburn curls piled high on her head, looking almost too perfect, too immaculate, under a modest black hat. She moved with a silent strength that defied her fragile appearance, placing the music box on the auction block without a word, before retreating to her shadowed corner. The bidding was sluggish. The music box was a luxury few could afford or justify. It was then that Sterling Croft saw his opportunity. He'd long coveted the Whispering Creek Ranch, which bordered his own land and had the best water rights in the valley. He'd tried to strong-arm the old man Hayes into selling, and now he was putting the squeeze on the widow, calling in debts, and making her life difficult. Humiliating her publicly would be another turn of the screw. Croft's voice boomed across the hall. $100! A collective gasp went through the crowd. The box was worth $30, maybe $40 on a good day. $100 for the box! Croft continued, a cruel smirk spreading across his face as he turned his gaze from Gwendolyn to Kai. And I'll wager my prize Hereford bull, the one that took the ribbon at the territorial fair, against 100 of Blackwood's dollars, that he can't prove he's man enough to warm the widow's bed tonight. The room erupted. Men guffawed. Others shifted uncomfortably. It was a brutal, ugly challenge. It wasn't just a bet, it was an accusation. It implied Gwendolyn was for sale, and that Kai, the half-breed giant, was nothing more than a savage who could be bought for a night's work. Gwendolyn froze her back ramrod straight. A faint blush of crimson crept up her neck, a stark contrast to her pale skin. Her hands, clasped in front of her, tightened until her knuckles were white. She did not look at Croft. She did not look at the leering faces in the crowd. Her gaze, sharp and piercing, shot directly to the back of the room and landed on Caelan Blackwood. Kai's expression was thunderous. The slate of his eyes had hardened into granite. Every instinct screamed at him to cross the room and break Croft's jaw. But he knew that's what the man wanted to see, the savage lose control. Violence here would land him in a cell or at the end of a rope. Croft had him pinned. To refuse the bet would be to admit cowardice in front of every man in the territory, a fatal blow to a reputation built on fearlessness. To accept was to become a party to the public degradation of a grieving woman. The auctioneer Byron Finch flapped his hands uselessly. Now, Mr. Croft, this is hardly the place. It's a public wager, Croft bellowed, cutting him off. Perfectly legal. Well, Blackwood, what's it to be? Are you man enough, or are you just a big shadow with nothing to cast it? Kai's jaw was a knot of steel. The room was silent, waiting. He could feel Gwendolyn Hayes's stare on him, not pleading but expectant. It was a look that held a challenge of its own, one he couldn't quite decipher. It was as if she were asking him a question he didn't yet understand. Slowly, deliberately, Kai reached into his vest and pulled out a worn leather purse. He didn't have $100 to spare. The debt he'd come to collect was $50, and he had perhaps another $20 to his name. The bet would ruin him financially if he lost. But honor once lost couldn't be earned back with gold. He walked forward, his heavy boots echoing on the wooden floorboards. He stopped before the auction block, his shadow falling over Sterling Croft. He ignored the smaller man completely, his eyes fixed on the widow. He opened the purse and counted out every last dollar he owned, placing the crumpled bills and scattered coins on the wood. It came to $73. "This is all I have," Kai said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the room. "And my word. I accept the wager." Croft's face split into a triumphant grin. He had won. He had forced the proud tracker into a corner and was about to thoroughly disgrace the widow Hayes. But then Gwendolyn Hayes moved. She glided from the shadows with a fluid grace that was mesmerizing. She walked not to Kai, nor to Croft, but to the auction block. Her green eyes were alight with a cold fire. She placed her hand on the silver music box, her claim to it absolute. "The terms are unacceptable," she stated, her voice clear and steady, ringing with an authority that stunned the crowd into silence. "My bed is not part of any man's wager." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. Then she turned her head, her gaze locking with Kai's. "However, Mr. Blackwood is a formidable-looking man. My ranch is isolated, and I have been troubled by unwelcome visitors of late." She let the implication hang in the air. Everyone knew Croft's men had been seen near her property line. "I will hire Mr. Blackwood as a guard for the night," she announced. "He will stay at my house in my employ. What he does on my property as my employee is my business." She turned her gaze cold as a winter morning onto Sterling Croft. "If he happens to be there until sunup, you will deliver your prize bull to my ranch as payment for this public slander. If he leaves before dawn, I will pay you the $100 myself. Do we have an accord, Mr. Croft?" She had masterfully turned the tables. She had taken his vulgar bet and reforged it into a business transaction, a contract for protection. She had seized control of the narrative, preserving a sliver of her dignity while accepting the grim reality of her situation. She was not a prize to be won. She was an employer hiring a guard. Croft was momentarily speechless, his victory soured. He had wanted to see her shamed begging. Instead, she stood defiant. But a bet was a bet, the core of it. Kai spending the night at her ranch remained. An accord. Croft spat his eyes, promising retribution. Gwendolyn gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. She looked at Kai, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Blackwood, my buggy is outside. You will follow me." Without another word, she turned and walked out of the auction house, her back straight, her head held high. Kai stood there for a moment, the $73 still sitting on the block. He swept the money back into his purse, his gaze meeting Croft's one last time. There was no triumph in Kai's eyes, only a cold, hard promise. Then he turned and followed the widow out into the blinding, unforgiving light of the Arizona sun. The wager had been set, but the game had just changed completely. The ride to the Whispering Creek Ranch was a study in tense silence. Gwendolyn Hayes handled the reins of her small buggy with a quiet competence, her posture betraying none of the turmoil that must have been churning within her. Kai followed behind, on his powerful buckskin stallion, a respectful distance between them. The town of Redemption Gulch receded its judgmental eyes, replaced by the vast, indifferent gaze of the desert. Saguaro cacti stood like silent sentinels, their arms raised to a sky of brilliant, merciless blue. The only sounds were the creak of the buggy's wheels, the clop of hooves on the hard-packed earth, and the whisper of the wind through brittle sagebrush. Kai watched the woman in front of him. He'd seen women of all kinds in his travels, hard-bitten saloon girls, pious homestead wives, fiery Spanish aristocrats. Gwendolyn Hayes was none of them. There was a core of refined steel beneath her mourning clothes, a carefully constructed fortress around her. Her maneuver at the auction had been a masterful piece of theatre, born of sharp intellect and sheer desperation. She hadn't saved her reputation. Not really, the whispers would follow her for years, but she had wrested control of her own humiliation, and in doing so, had denied Croft the full satisfaction of his cruelty. They travelled for the better part of an hour, turning off the main track onto a less-travelled road that wound its way into a shallow canyon. The air grew cooler here, and the dusty brown of the flats gave way to the pale green of cottonwoods and willows, a sure sign of water. The Whispering Creek Ranch was aptly named. It was nestled in a crook of the canyon, a modest but well-built adobe house shaded by two enormous cottonwood trees. A sturdy-looking barn and a series of corrals, most of them empty, stood nearby. The creek, the lifeblood of the place, gurgled softly, a ribbon of silver in the afternoon light. It was a good piece of land, defensible and well-watered. Kai understood immediately why Croft wanted it so badly. It was the key to controlling the whole valley. Gwendolyn pulled the buggy to a halt in front of the house, and sat for a moment, her hands resting on the reins, as if gathering her strength. Kai dismounted the leather of his saddle, creaking in the quiet. "You can water your horse at the trough by the barn." "Mr. Blackwood," she said, without turning to look at him. Her voice was strained, the composure from the auction house beginning to fray at the edges. Kai nodded, leading his horse away. He worked with an economy of motion, pumping water into the trough and stripping the saddle from the buckskin's sweaty back. He kept an eye on the house, on the woman who now stood on the porch, a lone black figure against the sun-bleached adobe. She seemed so out of place here, a creature of drawing rooms and soft light transplanted into the heart of a savage land. When he was done, he walked towards the house. She had gone inside, leaving the front door ajar. It was an invitation, but it felt more like a summons. He paused on the porch, his large frame filling the doorway. The interior of the house was surprisingly cool and dim. The furniture was heavy and dark, the property of a man of some means. It was tidy, almost obsessively so. A mantelpiece held a single severe-looking photograph of a grey-haired man with a grim expression, the late Bartholomew Hayes. Gwendolyn was standing by a small table, her back to him, pouring a glass of water from a ceramic pitcher. "Thank you for what you did, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice low. "Or rather, for what you are about to do." "I did nothing but accept a fool's bet," Kai rumbled, stepping inside. The house smelled faintly of dried lavender and wood smoke. She turned the glass of water in her hand. Her face was pale, and the fire in her eyes had been replaced by a profound weariness. "You accepted an insult to your honor to spare me a portion of mine. That is not nothing." She took a small sip of water. "I want to be clear about the terms of our arrangement. You hired a guard," he stated, his voice flat. "I guard. At dawn, I collect a bull from Sterling Croft." A bitter smile touched her lips. "It's not that simple, and we both know it. Croft won't be satisfied unless the whole town believes you have fulfilled the original terms of his disgusting wager. He wants me seen as a fallen woman. He wants you seen as a hired stud. He wants my name dragged through the mud so that when he finally forecloses on this ranch, no one will lift a finger to help the tainted widow." Kai said nothing. She was right, of course. The subtlety of her counteroffer would be lost on most. The story told in the saloons tomorrow would be the one Croft wanted told. "My husband," she continued, her gaze drifting to the photograph on the mantel, "was not a kind man. But he was a proud one. He borrowed heavily from Mr. Croft to expand this ranch, convinced he could triple his herd in 2 years. He was wrong. The debt is substantial. Croft holds the note. He has been pressuring me to sell to him for a pittance since the day Bartholomew was buried. And if you don't, he will find a way to ruin me and take the land for the debt." This stunt at the auction was his opening salvo, a way to isolate me from any respectable help in town. She looked back at Kai, her green eyes searching his face. "I cannot lose this place, Mr. Blackwood. It is all I have in the world. It is my only sanctuary." Kai thought of his own life, a series of temporary camps and dusty trails. He owned nothing but his horse, his guns, and his name. The idea of a sanctuary, a place to defend, was foreign to him. "So what is it you're truly asking of me?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. Gwendolyn took a deep breath, steeling herself. "I am asking you to play a part. Croft or one of his men will be watching the house tonight. I have no doubt of it. They will need to see you enter. They will need to see you stay. In the morning when you leave, I want you to do so, conspicuously. I want the story they tell to be a convincing one." She paused, the color rising in her cheeks again. "You will have the master bedroom. It is at the front of the house. The lamp will be lit. I will sleep in the small guest room at the back. Your presence here under this roof for one entire night is all I require." She was offering him a way to fulfill the letter of the bet while preserving the spirit of her own honor. It was a fragile compromise, a path walked on a knife's edge. "And the price?" Kai asked. He was no one's knight-errant. He lived by a code, but survival was its first and final rule. "The price is the bull from Croft," she said. "It's worth over $500. It will set you up well." "That's Croft's price," Kai corrected her gently. "I'm asking for yours." Gwendolyn looked surprised. She studied him for a long moment, taking in the sheer size of him, the weathered lines on his face that spoke of a hard life, the intelligence in his watchful eyes. She had assumed he was a simple man, a man of muscle and instinct. She was beginning to see she was mistaken. "I see," she said slowly. She walked over to a small locked writing desk and opened it with a key she wore on a chain around her neck. She withdrew a ledger and a small stack of banknotes. Bartholomew was in debt to many men, but he also had debtors of his own. Men who owed him for cattle, for seed, for water rights. She flipped through the ledger. "I am not a good bookkeeper, and I am a woman alone. Collecting these debts has proven difficult." She tapped a finger on a name. "Jedediah Prentice. He runs a freighting company out of Tucson. He owes the estate $200. He has ignored my letters." She looked up at Kai. "The bull from Croft is yours as per the wager. But from me, I will sign over the Prentice debt to you. If you can collect it, the $200 are yours. That is my price for this service." Kai considered it. It was a shrewd offer. She was paying him with money she couldn't collect herself, turning a bad debt into a useful asset. It was a gamble for him. Prentice might be a hard man to collect from, but it was a tangible payment beyond the public spectacle with Croft. It was a private contract between the two of them. It made the whole sordid affair feel cleaner. "Agreed," Kai said with a single nod. A visible wave of relief washed over Gwendolyn. She hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath. "Good," she whispered. She tore a page from the ledger detailing the debt and signed the bottom with a flourish, "Gwendolyn Hayes, Executrix." She handed the paper to him. Their fingers brushed as he took it. Her skin was cool, his was rough and calloused. For a fleeting instant, a current passed between them, an acknowledgement of their strange forced intimacy, of the dangerous bargain they had just struck. "Now," she said, her voice regaining its formal tone as she stepped back. "I will prepare some supper. You must be hungry. Then, Mr. Blackwood, the performance will begin." The sun began its slow descent, painting the canyon walls in fiery shades of orange and crimson. A simple meal was shared in near silence. Gwendolyn served a stew of jackrabbit and wild vegetables, along with fresh-baked bread. It was simple fare, but hearty and well-made. Kai ate with a quiet focus, aware of her watching him from across the small wooden table. The grand dining room was left in darkness. They ate in the kitchen, where the warmth from the cast-iron stove pushed back against the evening chill. "You're not from around here, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice soft in the growing twilight. It wasn't a question. Kai finished a piece of bread before answering. "I'm not from anywhere, Mrs. Hayes. Everyone is from somewhere," she countered gently. He looked up, his slate-grey eyes meeting hers. "Some places are better left behind." The finality in his tone closed the door on that line of conversation, but it opened another in Gwendolyn's mind. She too had a place she had left behind, a past she had sealed away as securely as the letters in her locked writing desk. She saw in him not a kindred spirit, but a fellow traveler in the land of chosen anonymity. After the meal, Kai took a plate of scraps out to the porch for a scrawny-looking dog that had been watching them from the edge of the yard. When he came back inside, Gwendolyn was lighting a kerosene lamp on the table. The flickering light cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, making the small kitchen seem both intimate and vast. "It's time," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She avoided his eyes, her attention fixed on trimming the lamp's wick. The front bedroom, the windows face the road. Kai simply nodded. He understood what was required. He walked from the kitchen, through the dark living area, and into the master bedroom. It was a large room, dominated by a heavy four-poster bed made of dark carved wood. The room smelled of his predecessor, Bartholomew Hayes, a faint, cloying scent of bay rum and stale cigars. It was the scent of a ghost. He walked to the window and looked out. The moon was rising a pale sliver in the indigo sky. He could see the road winding down the canyon. It was a perfect vantage point. Anyone watching the house would have a clear view of this window. With his huge frame silhouetted by the lamplight, his presence would be unmistakable. A few minutes later, Gwendolyn appeared at the doorway. She carried a second lamp, its glow illuminating her pale, tense face. She was holding a book in her other hand. "I will be in the room at the end of the hall," she said formally. "If you require anything." She trailed off the absurdity of the offer hanging in the air. "I won't," he said. She gave a tight, nervous nod. "Good night, Mr. Blackwood." "Mrs. Hayes." She turned and walked away, her soft footsteps fading down the hall. Kai was left alone in the dead man's room. He did not feel like a victor. He felt like a pawn in a game far more complex than a simple wager over a bull. He stood by the window for a long time, a silent giant shadow for any prying eyes to see. He knew Croft's man would be out there somewhere in the darkness, watching, judging, and preparing the story he would take back to town. He thought about the woman in the other room. He thought of her courage at the auction, her shrewdness in their negotiation, her quiet dignity in the face of utter humiliation. He had agreed to this for money and for pride. But standing here in this silent house, he felt a grudging respect for her that went beyond their contract. He was her guard in more ways than one. He was guarding her home, yes, but he was also guarding the last tattered remnants of her good name. Hours passed. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of settling wood and the distant cry of a coyote. Kai did not sleep. He was used to long, watchful nights on the trail. He sat in a chair by the window, his rifle across his lap, his senses alert. He wasn't just watching for Croft's man. He was listening to the language of the night. He could distinguish the rustle of a pack rat in the walls from the skittering of a scorpion across the floor. It was well past midnight when he heard it. A soft sound from down the hall, a floorboard groaning under a light weight. It was not the sound of a person walking, but of someone shifting, restless. He heard a faint sigh, a sound of such profound sorrow that it seemed to hang in the air. She was not sleeping either. She was lying awake in her small room, a prisoner in her own home, while a stranger occupied her dead husband's bed to satisfy a cruel man's wager. The reality of their situation, stark and ugly, settled heavily in the room. He thought of the look in her eyes at the auction, the defiance, the desperation, the flicker of something else he couldn't name. And he thought of her hair, that perfectly arranged, unnaturally uniform auburn hair. In a land of bleaching sun and constant dust, such perfection was an anomaly. It was a mask just like her quiet grief and her formal manners. Everyone out here wore a mask of some kind. His was one of dangerous competence and stoic silence. Hers was one of a respectable heartbroken widow. He wondered, as he stared out into the vast, uncaring darkness, what secrets her mask was hiding, The first hint of dawn was a pale grey line on the eastern horizon when Kai finally rose from his chair. The night watch was over. It was time for the final act of the performance. He walked to the door of the bedroom and opened it. He made sure it creaked. He strode down the hall, his boot heels deliberately heavy on the wooden floor. He stopped at her door, which was slightly ajar. He could hear the soft, even sound of her breathing. She had finally found sleep. He did not disturb her. He continued to the kitchen where he stoked the embers in the stove and put a pot of coffee on to boil. The smell of it filled the small house. It was a domestic, comforting smell, wildly at odds with the reason he was here. When the coffee was ready, he poured a cup and took it out to the porch, leaning against a post to watch the sun come up. He had fulfilled his part of the bargain. He had stayed the night. Soon he would ride back to town, a victor in a sordid bet. He would face Croft, claim his bull, and then ride on to Tucson to collect his $200 from Jedediah Prentice. He would be richer, his reputation intact. But as the sun crested the canyon rim, bathing the valley in a clean, golden light, Kai Blackwood didn't feel like a winner. He felt a strange emptiness, a disquiet that he couldn't quite name. He had spent the night guarding the widow's house, but he was leaving her more vulnerable than ever. The story of this night would follow her, branding her, isolating her further. His presence, meant to be a shield, would ultimately become another weapon used against her, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that Sterling Croft was far from finished with Gwendolyn Hayes. Gwendolyn found him on the porch, nursing the same cup of coffee, now cold. The sun was higher in the sky, and the day was already promising a familiar baking heat. She had changed out of her black dress into a simpler, more practical grey one. Her face was scrubbed clean, and without the strain of the previous day, she looked even younger. Her auburn hair was still impeccably pinned in place. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice a little husky with sleep. She held a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, though the morning was already warm. "Mrs. Hayes," he acknowledged with a nod. An awkward silence stretched between them. The purpose of his presence had been fulfilled, and now they were simply a man and a woman who were strangers linked by an uncomfortable transaction. "I trust your night was uneventful," she finally said. It was quiet. He looked out towards the road. Whoever was watching would have seen the light in the window until well after midnight. They'd have seen me on the porch this morning. The story will be a good one. She flinched almost imperceptibly at the word story. Yes. Well, that was the goal. She hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "Would you stay for breakfast, Mr. Blackwood? It seems the least I can offer." Kai was about to refuse. His instinct was to leave, to put this place and its complicated inhabitant behind him. But he looked at her at the faint shadows under her eyes, and saw not an employer, but a woman utterly alone. Staying for breakfast was not part of the deal. It was a simple act of human decency. "I'd be obliged," he said. The atmosphere in the kitchen was different this morning. The tension of the night had dissipated, replaced by a quiet, shared weariness. Gwendolyn moved with practiced efficiency, making pancakes and frying bacon. Kai refilled the coffee pot and sat at the table watching her. He was struck by the competence of her hands, whether holding reins, signing a contract, or flipping a pancake. She was not the fragile flower she appeared to be. "This is a fine piece of land," he remarked, breaking the silence. "The water is strong." It was what Bartholomew loved most about it. She replied, her back to him. He said water was more valuable than gold in this territory. He spent his life savings acquiring it. There was no fondness in her voice when she spoke her late husband's name, only a statement of fact. "Croft wants the water," Kai stated. "Croft wants everything." she said, a bitter edge to her voice. She brought 2 plates piled with food to the table and sat down opposite him. He believes this world was made for men like him to own. They ate in a more comfortable silence this time. Kai found himself reluctant to leave. He told himself it was because he wanted a decent meal, because the ride back to town would be hot and dusty. But there was another reason. He was curious. This woman was a puzzle, and he had always been drawn to puzzles. "You're educated," he said after a while. It wasn't a question. Her speech was precise, her vocabulary extensive. It was not the manner of a typical rancher's wife. She looked up from her plate, surprised. "My father was a professor of literature in Boston." "Boston is a long way from Redemption Gulch," he noted. A shadow passed over her face. "It's a different world." She pushed a piece of pancake around her plate, her appetite suddenly gone. "My family. We had a falling out. I came west to make a new life." "And you found Bartholomew Hayes," Kai finished for her. "I found a man who offered security," she corrected him quietly. "In this country, for a woman alone, that is a powerful currency, more valuable than water or gold." Kai understood. He had seen it 100 times. Women marrying for protection, for a roof over their heads, for a name that would shield them from the harsh realities of the frontier. He looked at the photograph of the grim-faced man on the mantelpiece and imagined this vibrant, intelligent woman shackled to him. It was its own kind of prison. After breakfast, he knew he could delay no longer. It was time to go. He stood up his chair, scraping against the wooden floor. "Thank you for the meal, Mrs. Hayes. I'll be on my way." She stood as well. "Of course. You have business in town with Mr. Croft." They walked to the front door together. The sun was bright and the day was in full swing. He stepped out onto the porch and she followed, leaning against the doorframe. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, her voice hesitant, "about last night, the way I handled things at the auction. I hope you do not think me unseemly." "I think you're a survivor, Mrs. Hayes," he said, turning to face her. "There's no shame in that." For the first time, a genuine smile touched her lips. It was a small, fleeting thing, but it transformed her face, chasing away the sorrow and revealing a glimpse of the woman she might have been in another life. "Thank you." He gave her a curt nod, about to turn away, but something made him pause. It was the hair. In the direct, unforgiving morning sun, he could see it more clearly. The way it sat on her head seemed solid. The auburn color was too uniform, lacking the natural variations of tone that even the most well-kept hair possessed. And at the hairline near her temple, there was a tiny, almost invisible ridge. It was the edge of a wig. The realization struck him not with a jolt, but with a quiet certainty. He had spent his life observing details. Others missed the faint print of a boot, the misplaced pebble, the nervous twitch of a liar's eye. The wig was just another detail. But why vanity? In a place like this, such a thing seemed trivial. Was her real hair grey? Was she bald from a fever? His gaze lingered for a fraction of a second too long. He saw a flicker of panic in her eyes, a sudden vulnerability, before her mask of composure slammed back into place. She straightened up her hand, instinctively going towards her head, as if to check that everything was secure. Kai gave no sign of what he had seen. He simply tipped his hat. "Good day to you, Mum." He strode to his horse, saddled it with practiced ease, and swung himself up. He rode away from the Whispering Creek Ranch without looking back, but the image of her standing on the porch, a lone figure guarding a house full of secrets, was burned into his mind. The wager was over, but the mystery of the widow Hayes had just begun. And Kaelin Blackwood, was not a man who could easily let a mystery go. Kai's confrontation with Sterling Croft was brief and brutally satisfying. He found the cattle baron holding court at the saloon, already regaling a captive audience with a lewd, exaggerated version of the previous night's events. Kai walked in, and the room fell silent. He didn't say a word. He simply stood in the doorway, his immense frame blocking the light, his granite eyes fixed on Croft. "Blackwood." Croft boomed a false heartiness in his voice. "Come to pay up, I hear the widow's hospitality is lacking." Kai walked to the bar, pulled the crumpled contract for the prentice debt from his pocket, and smoothed it out. Then he looked at Croft. "The bull," he said, his voice a low growl. "My man will be at your ranch within the hour to collect it. Make sure it's the prize winner. I'll know if it isn't." Croft's face mottled with rage. He had lost. In front of everyone, he had lost. He had to hand over his most valuable animal to the half-breed he despised. "You got lucky, Blackwood," he snarled. "Luck had nothing to do with it," Kai said calmly. He then turned to the rest of the saloon. "Let it be known," he announced, his voice carrying to every corner, "that Mrs. Hayes is a woman of her word, and she's under my protection now. Any of Croft's men found near Whispering Creek will answer to me." It was a direct public challenge. He had just escalated their private war into a territorial dispute. Croft was livid, but Kai's reputation was fearsome. No one was eager to test his threat. Without another word, Kai turned and walked out, leaving a simmering, humiliated Sterling Croft in his wake. He should have ridden for Tucson then and there. He had the contract, he had the bull on its way to be sold at the stockyards. He had business to attend to. But he couldn't. The image of Gwendalyn Hayes on her porch, the flicker of fear in her eyes when he'd noticed her hair, kept pulling him back. Why the wig? What was she hiding that was so terrible she would go to such lengths? He found himself riding not south to Tucson, but back north towards the canyon. He told himself he was just checking to make sure Croft hadn't sent men to her ranch immediately. He told himself he was just honoring the protective claim he'd made in the saloon. But he knew he was lying. He was drawn back by an invisible thread, a need to understand the puzzle. He arrived at the ranch as dusk was settling. He didn't ride up to the house. Instead, he tethered his horse in a thicket of mesquite and approached on foot, moving with the silence that was his trademark. A single lamp glowed in the kitchen window. He saw her silhouette as she moved about, preparing her solitary meal. He could have turned around then, his duty done. But he stayed concealed in the shadows of the barn, watching the small square of light in the vast darkness. An hour passed. The light in the kitchen went out and reappeared in the front bedroom, the room he had occupied. The room with the clear view of the road. What was she doing? Was she expecting him to return? He had to know. He moved from the barn to the side of the house, staying deep in the shadows until he was beneath the bedroom window. The curtains were thin. He could see her silhouette inside. She was standing before a vanity mirror, her back to the window. He watched as her hands went to her head. Slowly, deliberately, she began to remove the pins holding her hat and the elaborate wig in place. Kai felt a strange sense of intrusion, of violating a private ritual. He should leave, but he was rooted to the spot, compelled to see the truth. She lifted the auburn wig from her head. Kai braced himself for what he might see. Scars from a fire, the patchy baldness of an old sickness, the dull grey hair of a woman aged by grief. He saw none of those things. As the wig came off, what was revealed was a cascade of the blackest hair he had ever seen. It was a river of polished jet, thick and straight, falling well past her shoulders. It was the kind of hair that belonged to one people, and one people only. It was the hair of the End the People, his mother's people. But that wasn't what made him freeze. That wasn't what stole the air from his lungs and turned the blood in his veins to ice. As she turned her head slightly to place the wig on its stand, the lamplight caught the side of her neck just behind her left ear. And there, stark against her pale skin, was a faint, silvery scar. It was a scar he knew better than the lines on his own hand. It was a scar he had seen in his nightmares 1,000 times over the last 20 years. It was shaped like a lightning bolt. A memory violent and unwelcome ripped through him. A sun-drenched afternoon in the San Carlos Mountains. He was a boy of 10, wild and strong. She was a girl of 8, the chief's daughter, with eyes the color of new leaves and hair as black as a raven's wing. Her name was Tala, Little Hummingbird. They were playing a forbidden game, climbing the high, treacherous rock face they called the Sky Spear. He had been showing off, trying to get higher faster. He had dislodged a stone. It wasn't large, but it was sharp. He had shouted a warning, but it was too late. It struck her as she looked up, slicing a jagged line just behind her ear. He remembered the sight of her blood so bright against her skin. He remembered her tears. He remembered the shame and the terror he felt as he carried her back to the village. The shaman had stitched the wound, and the scar had remained a tiny, permanent lightning bolt. Their secret. 2 years later, the soldiers came. The world burned. He remembered smoke and screams and the flash of sabers. He was knocked unconscious and left for dead. When he awoke, everyone was gone. His parents, his friends, the entire village. Massacred. He had looked for Tala for the chief's family. He found nothing but death. He had believed for 20 years that she had died that day along with everyone else he had ever known. He stared at the woman in the window, his mind reeling. Gwendolyn Hayes did not exist. The Boston professor's daughter was a lie. The prim widow was a ghost. The woman in that room, the woman he had made a sordid bet over the woman he had just publicly claimed to protect, was Tala. Caelan Blackwood, the man who was never surprised, the man who could read any trail and predict any ambush, leaned his head against the cold adobe of the house and felt his entire world shatter. He didn't just freeze, he broke. Kai didn't move a statue of stone and shadow. The boy he'd been and the man he'd become were at war inside him. Finally, his legs obeyed. He walked with the heavy steps of a man meeting a ghost, pushing open the unlatched door and striding into the house. She heard him whirling from her vanity mirror, her long black hair swirling around her shoulders as she grabbed a shawl to cover it. Her eyes were wide with terror. "What are you doing here?" she cried, backing away. "How did you get in?" He didn't answer her question, his eyes locked on her face, seeing the child he once knew. "Tala," he whispered. The name was a key, turning a lock 20 years rusted. Her entire body went rigid. The terror in her eyes was replaced by sheer shock. "How do you know that name?" she breathed. He took a step closer, gesturing to the silvery mark behind her ear. "The Sky Spear," he said, his voice thick with memory. "I gave you that scar. I let the stone fall." Recognition dawned, chasing the terror from her eyes. It was a fragile, impossible hope. "Caelan." The name was a puff of air. "But you died. The soldiers. I saw you fall. I was left for dead," he said, his voice raw. "When I woke up, everything was gone. I thought you were dead, too." The strength drained from her legs. The carefully constructed walls of Gwendolyn Hayes crumbled into dust, and she sank to the floor, a great shuddering sob tearing through her. Kai knelt awkwardly before her as her story tumbled out, a harrowing tale of survival. She had been found hiding amidst the carnage by a cavalry captain, who instead of killing her had taken her. Stripped of her name, she was christened Odessa Vance and sent to a government boarding school in Pennsylvania. It was a place designed to kill the Indian, save the child, a prison of forced assimilation where her language was beaten out of her and her culture systematically erased. There Tala had died, and a ghost forged in loneliness and fear learned to survive. At 18, she ran drifting west, always hiding. She invented Gwendalyn, the disgraced Boston intellectual, a fiction to shield her from a world that would destroy Odessa Vance. Bartholomew Hayes was a cruel man, she whispered, but he offered me his name and this isolation, a place to stop running. The auburn wig was the final piece of the disguise, a way to bury the last visible trace of the girl from San Carlos. "I saw you at the auction," she confessed, looking at him properly for the first time. "I knew it was you. I thought I was seeing a ghost sent to destroy me. When Croft made that bet, I did the only thing I could think of to control the situation." He understood now the strange challenge in her eyes. It had been a test. He briefly told her his own story of being found and raised by a solitary trapper, of learning to live between two worlds belonging to neither. They sat in the lamplight, two ghosts in a dead man's house, piecing together their shattered pasts. The boy who gave the scar and the girl who wore it were gone. In their place were a hard, lonely man and a haunted, resilient woman, the last two survivors of a forgotten world. The bet, the auction. Croft, it all seemed trivial now. "What do we do now, Kaelin?" Tala asked, her voice small. Kai looked at her, the last living piece of his history, and felt a purpose he hadn't known in 20 years. "We stop running," he said, his voice filled with a conviction that surprised them both. "This is your land now, and no one is going to take it from you." Dawn broke with a sense of inevitability. As expected, Sterling Croft and his foreman rode into the yard, mid-morning arrogance radiating from them. He had come to gloat over a broken widow, but found Tala standing beside Kai, her long black hair flowing freely, her gaze defiant. Croft's eyes widened a sneer, twisting his lips. "Well, well," he mocked. "Looks like Hayes married himself some squaw." But his taunts fell flat. Tala stood her ground, her voice ringing with newfound strength as she claimed her name and her land. They countered his threats of foreclosure with cold facts gleaned from her late husband's ledgers, turning his own tactics against him, with debts he owed for water and grazing rights. The money from the bull he'd wagered was now their war chest. Enraged and outmaneuvered, Croft reached for his gun, but Kai was faster. "A new wager, Croft." Kai's voice was deadly calm. "Fists only. You win, the ranch is yours. I win, you forgive the debt and never return." Seeing a chance to reclaim his honor through brute force, Croft accepted. The fight was not long, but it was brutal. Croft's rage was no match for Kai's focused power. He fought not for pride, but to defend the last piece of his past and their only hope for a future. He left Croft broken and gasping in the dust. Defeated in body and spirit, Croft mounted his horse and rode away, a man who had lost everything. On the porch, Kai and Tala watched him go. The cruel bet was over. A new unspoken wager to build a life from the ashes of their past had just begun. So ends the tale of Kaelin Blackwood and the widow Hayes, a story that started with a cruel bet at a dusty auction and ended with the reclamation of a stolen past. It's a testament to the fact that in the unforgiving heart of the Old West, identity was a currency as valuable as gold, and survival often meant burying the person you once were. But sometimes The ghosts of the past don't come back to haunt us. They come back to save us. Tala and Kai, two lost souls from a forgotten world, found in each other not just a shared history, but the promise of a future. Their fight against Sterling Croft was just the beginning. The world was still a dangerous place, and their newfound peace was a fragile thing. What other challenges and enemies would rise to test their bond? If this story of secret survival and redemption in the untamed West captured your imagination, be sure to hit that like button and share it with fellow history and drama lovers. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. We have countless more tales of grit honor and the hidden histories of the American frontier waiting to be told. You won't want to miss what happens next.